Before I start my presentation, I show you this picture. This is the picture of a local miner was taking a rest after working in a tin mining residues area. My name is Fatimah Zahrawati from Indonesia, and I work for Indonesian Nuclear Energy Regulatory Agency, and my paper title is Analysis of Indonesian Policy on the Management of Norm Waste and Residues and the Implementation Problems. There are some mining and industrial activities in Indonesia that produce waste contain a small number of radioactive materials. And the enormous amount of norm residues is in Bangka Belitung province, that is the largest tin mining producer in Indonesia since a very long time ago. This picture shows you many local people are working on the area of tailing and residues from the tin mining in Bangka Belitung. You can imagine the hazard from chemical and also from radioactive exposure could affect the workers in this area. And this map shows you the dose rate mapping in Indonesia, and this circle shows you the Bangka Belitung areas that has higher dose rate compared to other areas in Indonesia. The chronic risk of the low-level radiation from norm exposure can affect workers, the public, and the environment. The residues of tin mining contain monazite, xenotime, and xenotime. And to tackle this problem, the government tried to enact some regulations to manage norm residues. The problems are there are several regulations have been enacted that are initiated by different authorities such as Nuclear Energy Regulatory Agency or BAPTEN that responsible to ensure the safety and security of nuclear energy utilization, and number two is Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, who's responsible in formulating and implementing policy regarding establishment of energy and mineral resources. And we have the Ministry of Environment and Forestry that responsible in related to environment and forestry. And we have the Bangka Belitung as the local government. This regulation have different perspective and view on how to deal with norm residues. Now the questions that I'm trying to address in this talk are, how are these regulations implemented? Can they solve the problems of norm residues in Indonesia? The purposes of the study are the first one to reveal the issues of the implementation of the norm management regulations in Indonesia and to give recommendations on how to solve the problems. The methods are the first one, literature analysis of primary regulations, related journals and articles, and conduct an interview with the Deputy Director for Licensing of Non-Nuclear Reactor Installation of BAPTEN. Before we start to looking at the regulation related to norm management in Indonesia, it is necessary to know the hierarchy of regulations in Indonesia. So based on the Act on the law concerning making regulations, the hierarchy regulation in Indonesia is presented in this picture, where the 1945 Constitution is the basis for the formation of all regulations, and we have the resolution of the People's Representative Council, acts, government regulation, presidential regulation, and regional regulation. And beside all of these regulations, we still have another regulation that is called ministry level regulations. The basic principle is the lower level regulation should be harmonized and consistent with the higher level regulations. And the power of rules depends on the hierarchy that shows in this picture. Now let's see the hierarchy of norm residues regulations in Indonesia. So in the level of Act, we have the Act on Mining Minerals and Coals in 2009. Even though this regulation has been revised in this year and published June 2020, the provision regarding to norm residues is still the same. So this act is initiated by Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. And in the level of government regulation, we have the government regulation on the management of dangerous waste 2014 and enacted by Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and we have the regional regulation, the Bangka Belitung Governor Regulation on the management of tin mining mineral byproduct in 2019. And in the level of ministry or institutional regulation, we have the Bapeten regulation on intervention from norm exposure in 2009 and on radiation safety on storing of TNORM in 2013. Now let's analyze the provision for each regulations. We start from the Act on Mining Minerals and Coals. Based on this Act, if the mining residues do not contain radioactive materials, the miners can own and reprocess the minerals byproduct or residues. However, if the mining residues contain radioactive materials, the miners cannot own the residues. This provision will increase the deposit of mining residues, and also there is no explanation what should producers do to manage the residues that contain radioactive materials. Now let's move to the Bapeten government regulation on T-norm exposure intervention. In this regulation, they provide the criteria of intervention level, and it is mentioned that if the mining residues contain radioactive material with the activity concentration and the contamination level above the intervention level, the producers should take remedial action or intervention to reduce the concentration, activity, and contamination level. If they can be reduced, the producer of waste can do reprocess and reuse the residues. Or if no, the producer of waste the residues should be stored, and this activity can increase the land use for storage facility. Another regulation from Bapeten related to norm residues is the safety requirement for storing TNORM 2013. This regulation continues the previous provision from in the TNORM exposure intervention regulation 2009. So in this regulation, if the residue should be stored, the producer of residue should apply for a license to Bapeten. Something unique in here, it is mentioned that during the license period, the licensee can use the residues. However, there is no limitation of the activity concentration and contamination level in here. And it is also mentioned that the licenses are subject to other applicable regulation from other related authorities. And there is no explanation which authorities. Now we move to the government regulation on the management of dangerous waste. In this regulation, the mining residues or other industrial residues called dangerous waste. So if the dangerous waste contain the radioactive materials with the activity concentration and contamination level are above the intervention level, the waste producer is not allowed to reprocess or reuse the waste, except they can be reduced to meet the criteria of intervention level. And they should apply a license to reuse to the Ministry of Environment. However, if the activity concentrations and the contamination level cannot be reduced, they should dispose all of the material to the disposal facility for specific waste level 2. This provision will increase the land use for disposal facility. Now let's see how the Bangka Belitung governor regulations regulate norm residues in this province. This regulations special for tin mining residues. It is mentioned that the producer of residues can collaborate with other companies that have facilities to process the tin mining residues and byproduct to do reprocessing, purifying, or mixing with other mining commodities. But if the producer will not process the radioactive materials that are contained in the residues materials, they should transfer the materials to entities that are capable to store and process them. So this regulation has different point of view how to deal with the norm residues. Now, what if we compile all provision from this regulation into one diagram? So, if the mining residues contain radioactive materials, based on the Act 2009, the producer of waste is not allowed to own the residues. However, based on the Governor Regulation 2019, is allowed to sell, reuse, and reprocess. However, based on the government regulation and Bapeten regulation, it is mentioned that if the activity concentration and the contamination level are above the intervention level, the producer of residues should take remedial actions or intervention to reduce the limit. If the limit can be reduced, the producer of waste can reuse the materials and apply for a license to the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. If no, based on the government regulation, the materials should be disposed. However, based on the Bapeten regulation, the materials should be stored and they should apply a license to Bapeten. And they can reuse the material during the license period and they should apply for a license to reuse to other authorities. Based on the analysis in the previous slide, we can discuss that which regulation should be followed by the producer of waste or residue. It confuses the user. In the point of view of hierarchy regulation, the Act is the highest level regulation in here. Due to the different perspective and terminology used in those regulations, it can cause implementations problem. For example, it should be dangerous waste, tin norm, or tin mining byproduct or residues. There are conflict of power among authorities. There is unclear link among regulations. What should the producer do with their residues? For example, they should be disposed, stored, or can be reused. Currently, there is no specific disposal facility for non-residues disposal in Indonesia. And Indonesia consists of many islands. It would be costly to transport the vast amount of residues if the government tried to create one area for disposal facility. Now let's see current storing licenses issued by Bapeten. There are 18 licenses or permits that have been issued by Bapeten for storing the residues, which are mostly in Bangka Belitung Islands. Based on the regulations, the license is only valid for 5 years, so the licensee should renew the permit every 5 years. And until now, during the storing license period, there is only one negative statement or recommendation from Bapeten to allow the licensee to reuse the residues for sandblasting activity. It is difficult to reduce contamination level and activity concentration to meet the criteria of intervention level. Finally, we arrive in the conclusions and recommendations. We can conclude that the conflicting regulations in Indonesia show a lack of coordination between entities or authorities. Storing tin mining residues is not a practical solution for the norm residues in Indonesia. And also, the prohibition against reusing the residues above the intervention level might cause problems that will increase the land use for storage and disposal facilities. It is necessary to harmonize the norm-related regulations in Indonesia. And the recommendations are: conduct a full analysis of norm-related regulations in Indonesia by using the regulatory impact assessment tool. And also make agreement among authorities to set their role is necessary to avoid overlapping provisions. Involve stakeholders in the process of making the regulations to enhance their effectiveness. Finally, this is the end of my presentation. A very good quote from Hillary Clinton said that there's nothing magic about regulations. Too much is bad, too little is bad. Thank you very much for your kindly attention.